I want to welcome now Jang. He's the Chief Strategy Officer and Vice President of Research Busara and the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. He's also on the board of directors, and he's helped to lead the organization since 2013. Channing's responsible for both internal and external strategy and a portfolio of projects primarily focused on academic research. Prior to joining Busara, he worked as an English teacher in the Czech Republic and an equities and derivatives trader in Los Angeles. But more importantly, he's completed a postdoc at Princeton University in psychology and public affairs and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Hawaii with a specialization in behavioral economics and development. He completed his undergraduate studies in managerial economics at the University of California, Davis. And one of the reasons we really wanted to ask Channing to do this is that there's a lot of talk, well, huge amounts of talk about behavioral economics, not least because Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize for economics last year for his work on behavioral economics. And we know that the kind of discipline of this whole area comes from two areas, from the economics field and from the behavioral science field. But there's obviously a great deal of relevance and crossover to what we do. But most of the research, the vast majority of the research and literature on behavioral economics has been applied to industrialized countries. There's not so much either literature or analysis or commentary on how it's applied to development settings. And one of the things we really wanted to ask Channing to talk about was how that could, how we can start thinking about that. So Channing, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you to the conference organizers for putting on a great event and inviting me here today. As you mentioned, my name is Jang, and I work for the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, which is a research organization that's based in Nairobi. So today I have a short presentation, and then I think we're going to really open up the floor to talk about behavioral economics, its overlaps with SBCC, and how we can really work together to move the entire field forward. Let's see. Oh, here we go. So the title of my presentation is quite boring. It's Thinking Like a Behavioral Economist. Hopefully at the end of this, you'll at least think like a behavioral economist, or you'll think like me, which is a close second. And the first question I had to think about was, oh, this isn't working. Does the world need another acronym? Do we need another BE on top of the HCD, on top of the SBCC, and then some people have been cutting the C. I've heard SBC around here without the extra C. I don't know if we need another acronym in the world, so that's the topic of my conversation. What is BE? What might it bring to this field? Next slide. So to do this, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about how to think like a behavioral economist. This is really a fancy excuse to get us to do some fun classroom games that always goes over well. Second, I'm going to talk about a weird problem in behavioral economics. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the combination of BE and SBCC. What does BE do differently than SBCC? And what might it do well? What might it do not so well? And how can we think about working together? Okay, next slide. Okay, so thinking like a behavioral economist. This is not really very technical. This is a chance to get you guys to move a little bit, because I know it's the end of the day and everyone's just thinking about where the happy hour is. So hopefully this will get people energized a little bit. So I just have a few quiz questions that hopefully will get your mind thinking like a behavioral economist. This is stuff I think about all the time. So the first one, next. Okay, first question. How many animals did Moses take into the ark? There's no prize for the winner, and I don't want to hear any atheism talk, so let's just pretend historically, biblically, someone throw out an example or how we might think about this problem. No, what's that? Very good, very good. So if you actually look at this, in the next slide, I'm really talking about Moses here, and yeah, Moses didn't bring any animals into the ark. And you know, this is cute, and I really stacked the deck to make this actually make sense. So if you caught that immediately, good on you. You're thinking like a very rational human being. But you know, I put the image of an ark, I put the biblical thing, and I really structured the information to make you think that way. So this is an example of really how the information around you really shapes the choices that you end up making. Next slide. Okay, so here's another good one. This is probably the only time you'll ever ask to be taking out your phone in a plenary. So everyone take out your phone. I want you to take out your phone for real, take out your phone, and I want you to look at the number of the person that you last called, the phone number of the person that you last called. I'm going to give you 5 more seconds to do that. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, everyone put their phone away? All right, everyone got that number? Okay, so there's a little trick. The question I want to ask you is, what time is it exactly? Does anyone know, without looking at their phone or their watch, what time it is right now? Oh, just around 6. Okay, good. And this is a really example of showing you that information's all around you. When you pull out your phone, the first thing most people see on their lock screen is their clock. But I wasn't asking you to look at your clock. I was asking you to look at your phone number. So when we're designing things, we have to think about the choices that we make under the right circumstances. That information can be lost, or that information without the flow doesn't really make any sense. So when we're designing communication strategies, when we're designing policy, we really want to think about the whole architecture of the situation. Okay, next slide. This is a really cute example from the literature. This isn't ours, I wish it was, where people were trying to get people to reuse their towels. I'm sure you guys have seen this in your hotels. I haven't seen this in the Westin, which probably says something about 5-star hotels and the inequality talk this morning. But their goal was to get people to reuse their towels, and they tried these different treatments. They randomized these placards in different people's rooms. The first one said, reuse your towel to help the environment. The second one said, the majority of guests in this hotel reuse their towels. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see what it was like. So it resulted in about a 6% increase in towel reuse. That's great, good for the environment. And you can see that it very clearly talks about social norms, right? Talks about what's normal for people in the hotel. They wanted to take it a step further, so they tried one more treatment. And in the next slide, we can see what happens. And they said the majority of guests in your room, the majority of people that stayed in your room have reused their towel. And that drove it up another 6%, just by adding those 3 words. Very small words, but very powerful about identity, right? It's easy to think, well, guests in this hotel, there's people that are staying in, in James's executive suite. There's people that are staying, with my colleague Tom that's down the street. It might not be me, but when you're talking about someone in your room, that really says, okay, this person's probably like me. I should probably be reusing my towel as well. So identity is a really strong issue that people think about. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what does this all say? I think economics comes from this world where everyone's rational. Everyone is Spock. They're a computer. They're optimizing. They're maximizing their utility function. And I think what we've learned in behavioral economics is, as you can see in the next slide, that there are lots of things that interrupt this rationality. There are biases, limited attention, bounded rationality, heuristics, fallacies that happen. And I think behavioral economics really is all about this word called predictably irrational. And this is I wish this was mine on the next slide. This is a term that Dan Ariely coined, which really is about, okay, humans don't have to be rational, but if economists understand how to predict them and understand them, then we know what to do. Then we can design for that. We can design architectures to help people make the decisions that they want to make. So predictably irrational is a good way to describe how behavioral economists like to think about the world. Okay, next slide. Okay, now I'm going to talk about behavioral economics and the weird problem. So what is behavioral economics and the weird problem? Let's take a look. Okay, so I'm going to show you 2 maps. This is the first map, and this is the map according to what? What do you guys think? What's that? Voting, no. It's actually population. So world according to population. And actually, it looks pretty good. Shout out to Indonesia here. Good representation, 180 million people, and that's in the islands. But you can see India's a little bit bigger, China, Russia, a little bit bigger, and then, maybe Mexico's a little too big and squeezed in other places. But the next map I'm going to show you, this is the world according to research. This is the world according to how many published papers are done in each of these countries. And of all these little places, this little peninsula that was once Africa and now looks more like Italy, that's where Busara sits. And we're really trying to tackle this problem that in the global south, there's actually very little research, even though so much aid, so much interest is going into development. Not much of that research comes from the place where we're trying to help. So in the next slide, I'll tell you about the weird problem, which is Again, not mine. I wish I made up this term. This was made up by an anthropologist, sociologist named Joseph Heinrich, and he came up with this coin that said most of the research comes from these Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries studying these weird people. A lot of the experimental work, a lot of the economic work that is a foundation of behavioral economics comes from college undergrads, people from Oxford, people from Stanford getting beer money. I'm not sure that's the same kind of person as the people in Kibera or the people outside Bali. And it's interesting, I would like maybe a show of hands. Who here is weird? Okay, yeah, so even in this room, we're a little bit weird, but I think that's the hope, is that we're trying to do more and more research in developing countries to understand how context matters. Okay, next slide. Okay, so predictably rational is good, but I think at Busara we really believe that context and scarcity can shift the weighting and availability of these things. So yes, everyone might have certain biases or heuristics that they fall prey to, but depending on the context, where you're from, your history, your social environment, and depending on the scarcity of the environment that you live in, that might change the weighting and availability. Okay, so this is a really nice example. So assume you're given a choice. I'm giving you a choice between $60 today or $75 next month. So no right or wrong answer. By a show of hands, who's interested in $60 today? Okay? Who's interested in $75 next month? Okay, a lot of people waiting for that extra 15 bucks. I like it. Okay, next slide. Okay, so you're given another choice. You're getting $60 in 6 months, or I'll give you $75 in 7 months. So who's interested in $60 in 6 months? Okay, a few, one person there. And who's interested in $75 in 7 months? Okay, almost everyone. And you guys are all behavioral economists now, so you all see what I did. The question's exactly the same. I'm just shifting the time frame by 6 months. But I'm essentially asking you, how much are you willing to wait for? How much are you willing to wait for 1 month? It's the exact same question. And we actually ran this question across 5 countries with the help of the WDR, and here's what we found. And we found that there's this very clear measure of hyperbolic discounting, that people will become more patient when the frame of reference is shifted out. So if everyone were rational, the blue bar and the green bar would be exactly the same height, regardless of where you were. And what was interesting is we actually see that this is a fairly stable phenomenon across countries, and a fairly stable phenomenon across both rich and poor. And that's really cool because we see that this heuristic or this bias that people fall prey to, this hyperbolic discounting, is actually maybe universal. But what's also interesting is at Busara we run a host of cross-cultural studies, not just across cultures or geographies, but across socio-economic boundaries, and we see that those don't always hold. Sometimes people are more rational in Kenya than they are in New Jersey, but sometimes it's the people in Trenton and Kibera that act more similar than the people at Princeton or in the high-rises of Nairobi. So it's really important to think about context. Okay. The other thing is really thinking about a psychological poverty trap. And a lot of our work was founded, and I did a lot of my PhD work on how stress affects decision-making. And actually what we would do to stress people out is something very similar to this, is have them speak in front of a panel of people. So I now kind of feel my cortisol levels rising, and I feel myself being impatient and impulsive. But the thought is that you're not poor because you make bad decisions. But when you are poor, that act of being poor can lead you to make bad decisions. So within that context of scarcity, the way that you think about the world is often different. And we've all seen this when you're hungry, when you're tired, but we've also, I think more and more the literature has started to show that this actually matters when you're in a situation of poverty. And not just poverty of resources, but poverty of time as well. Okay. So understanding context and scarcity really matters. Next. And then I'm just going to give you my brief spiel about Busara. So Busara is an NGO that's based in Nairobi. Next slide. And our mission is to advance and apply behavioral science in pursuit of poverty alleviation. So that's all that we're going to do, and we work with organizations to do that. So next slide. We work with everyone, businesses, governments, nonprofits, foundations, academics, anyone. Okay? And our geographic focus kind of tries to match this weirdness. And we started in Kenya, and we've since started growing out of Kenya. But the whole idea is to really be based in the context and the cultures that we're trying to work. Okay. All right, so BE and SBCC. Let's talk about that. I have 7 minutes. Okay, perfect. What's different? What's the same? Okay. So I think they said this about artists, but I think it's true about economists as well. Good economists copy, great economists steal. And I think economists have a long history of stealing the best ideas from other disciplines and bringing it into their own, putting a paint of math on it, and calling it something different. I don't think behavioral economics is any different. A lot of the ideas, in fact, have come from social psychology, health, sociology, anthropology. And I think that's what's nice about economists is we're kind of unabashed thieves about things, but we try to make things our own a little bit. So in the next slide, but a lot of people will ask as you go around the room and you talk to behavioral economists, they'll tell you all these things. You'll talk about biases. You'll talk about understanding context, and it's very obvious to say, well, that's exactly what my domain does. That's exactly my area of expertise. Where's the economics? I don't understand what you're adding that's very different. And I've been reflecting on this, and this is my take on what I think some of the things are different. But I would love to hear from all of you on what you think behavioral economics might add and where it really is different. So next. So here's the first thing that I think is different, and it's not different in the sense that other disciplines don't do it, but it's different in the sense that this is what I think behavioral economists care most about. And the first one is modeling. So behavioral economists and economists in general love to predict things, right? We really want, that's why we love rationality, is we want to be able to predict what humans are going to do. And even in the face of all these biases and heuristics, we still want to find someone that's predictably irrational. So our modeling is always trying to incorporate these ideas, incorporate these anomalies or strange behaviors, and make them explainable. So we really try to think about through the lens of individual utility maximization and trying to model a behavior that may seem strange is actually quite rational. So that's the first thing that we're always trying to do. Okay? The second thing we're trying to do is that we love data. We love data all in everything that we do. We love measuring things in the field, in surveys, in the lab, in big longitudinal surveys, in phone surveys, SMS surveys, IVR, anything that you want. And we really like to think about revealed preference rather than stated preference. So rather than asking people what they want to do or what they think, we try to measure it. We try to measure it with money. We try to measure it with choices, real choices, as much as possible. And finally, we love working with big data and trying to see how behaviors can be shaped and be explained by big data. And then finally, we love causality. We love causality. And we love to know that this thing caused this thing. Not this thing was associated with this thing, or this thing may have happened at the same time as this thing, but this thing caused this other thing. And that leads to the R word that I hear people, it's a curse word now, RCT. So this is the gold standard of what we love to do is work with experiments. Now, RCTs are wonderful, and we love them as much as the next person. I think they've gotten a bad rap, and I blame myself and I blame economists for doing this because we do them in a very long and protracted way to look at impact, where I think a lot of the experiments that we at Busara like to do and I think would be more useful to the field is experiments to help make decisions. The same way Google A/B tests 10 shades of green before they launch, we should be A/B testing a lot of the things that we do before they go out. So a lot of the work that we do with SBCC is actually pre-testing a lot of communications before they're launched to the mass media. We actually take a small group of people, A/B test them, and that's how we establish causality. So you can do randomized control trials without doing randomized control trials. So hopefully that explains some of what I think behavioral economists can bring to this field. Okay? So what you'll get when you're working with a behavioral economist, I made a short laundry list, and hopefully you guys can add to it. So the first thing is, next, is you'll get laser focus on mechanisms that drive individual behavior. We love thinking about what is the very specific psychological, neurological, cognitive mechanism driving individual behavior, and how do we really hone in on it. The next thing is an unreasonable obsession with causality. We really love to know that this thing caused this thing. It's a really important distinction. The third thing is we're really good with data. We're not budget and finance people. That really confuses a lot of people when I talk to them. I say, I'm a behavioral economist. Like, great, I need you in my program. You can explain to people how this program needs more budget to my head office. I'm actually terrible with that stuff. But we're good with data. Next. You can learn some good new jargon to impress your friends with. That's also very useful in this field and probably all fields. I've learned some really good jargon at this conference, so hopefully I'll be able to bring it back and continue to take. Next. You'll hear a lot of frequent misuse of the word qualitative research. Behavioral economists are terrible at qualitative research. Anything that's not an RCT is qualitative research, and I've learned that that's not true. So please pardon our ignorance on that field. Next. You'll get an incomplete model of human behavior. One thing I think that behavioral economists and economists can learn from other fields is really how to model behavior within a certain context. We have one model based on utility maximization. We find something's wrong with that, and we edit the model slightly to add in this one new thing. But it's not ground up. It's about iterating, not thinking hard about a foundational model of human behavior. And that is something that I think that behavioral economists could learn a lot from this field. And then finally, the hope is some new tools. And hopefully from behavioral economists, you can learn some new tools to solve the same problems. And on the next slide, I think you guys have all seen this picture, and I think of this when I think about SBCC and HCD and behavioral economics is, we're all trying to say the same problem. We're all trying to identify that big elephant in the room. How do we change behavior? How do we shift norms? What's working? What's not working? And I think we're using the same toolkits, but, we're feeling different parts of the elephant, and we're calling it different things because, I call something a heuristic. I call, someone else calls something a design sprint or a rapid testing or something like that. And that jargon ends up being something that keeps us apart rather than brings us together. So I want everyone to remember that. Okay, next slide. So here's some tips on how to work with the new kids on the block and incorporate behavioral economics into your work. And there's 4 things that I've been talking with people at this conference on how to do, and I'd love to hear other thoughts about this. So the first one is a melting pot approach, which I think would be wonderful. Everyone became some HCD, SBC behavioral economist and was just like a fully formed transformer, and that would be wonderful if you could do that. I don't think any of us have enough time to really do that. So the next one would be kind of, go back. Sorry. Yeah, the next one would be like, using BE as like a scalpel, a precise tool, and we do this a lot, where they bring us in to solve a very specific problem that has a very specific decision that you want to make at the end of, and you want to very carefully describe causality and very carefully understand human decision-making in that one context. There's a salad, which is kind of like, let's just put them all in the room and, USAID loves putting BE and HCD and all these other things together, so just put them in the room together and they'll figure it out. That's the salad approach that sometimes works really beautifully and sometimes makes the salads I make for my wife. And then finally, there's also a baton approach, which is, each different discipline has specialties in different phase of trying to solve this problem. Let's hand this off and see where we can get to. I think all of these are very valid methods if we do them carefully, and I think this next slide is basically, we're kids here. We're trying to figure out how to make this approach work, so we should keep experimenting with it. Okay, so in the last minute, I have a bonus slides, which are biases you'll see at SBCC. So hopefully you guys will see this and take them and think about more biases that you see at SBCC, and you can tell us or put it on Twitter. I stole most of the pictures from Twitter, so you can continue to post. Okay. So next slide. So social herding, I saw this, someone posted a digital green booth. I've noticed that if you get like 2 people in front of a poster, even if they're your friends, other people will come around that poster. It's a very important social technique that I used earlier today with my colleague. The next one, planning fallacy. People here are scheduling meetings all the time, and they're going to go to all the sessions, and they're going to host their own event, and they're going to catch up with all the work email and the deep thinking that they said that they were going to do to their boss so that they could get the per diem. That never happens. Next thing. In-group, out-group identity. I walked here on the first day, and I felt naked. And then I got this thing, and I felt amazing. Amazing. And, you're in their in-group now. I look down at the other people that don't have these things. I went home, and I didn't even take this off. And my wife said, "What is that?" I'm like, "You wouldn't know." Next slide. Default. I bet you'll notice this more on the different sessions that you go to, but you tend to sit in the same chair that you always do, and you see this all the time. You sit in the same chair, you do things the same way. I realized today that the SBCC app had a way to contact people. I've been asking them for their WhatsApp forever, and it's such a pain in the ass, and there's a new way to do things, and the default meant that I just continue to do the things in a much worse way. Next slide. Reference-dependent preferences. This is an interesting one. So this is a picture of a foggy door here at the conference. And when I'm in here, I'm freezing cold. I can't wait to get out of this. This just reminds me of how balmy and clammy and wet it is. But when I'm outside for like 2 minutes, I want to just get in that ice locker. It looks like a beer cooler. I just want it really badly. So depending on where you are, your reference point will change your preferences. And then next one. And then choice overload. This is one for food and for scheduling. It's impossible to go to all the sessions you want. It's impossible to choose. I'm paralyzed and end up like standing in between the 2 meeting rooms trying to duck my head into one and the other at the same time. And the same with the food. I think I've gained 3 pounds just eating all this food. And then, finally, that leads to this idea of loss aversion. I just realized on Twitter that Marvel was here, and I love Marvel, and I didn't get to go. And now I feel horrible about it. And we know that behavioral economics tells us that people hate losses more than they love gains. So think carefully when you're choosing your sessions. Okay, so to close, does the world need another acronym? I don't know. I think this is what we're hoping to talk about. And yeah, I'm glad that we were able to talk about it. And I'd be very curious to learn what lessons we can learn about combining new disciplines into SBCC. Thank you.